Sailing with your friends through a tropical paradise, your ship stocked up with plenty of rum. Everyone around you fears the very sight of your crew, and there is plenty of money to be made with every successful boarding. The pirate's life on paper sounds almost fun, doesn't it? Take a closer look and you will soon realize that this was not the case in reality. Many of these people, pirate captains that is, were aggressive and antisocial, thrust into a life of crime and violence, which given the status of some captains likely went to their heads. Pirate ships traversed the Caribbean in the golden age of piracy, equipped not only with guns and cannons, but with their own sets of internal laws and regulations. These codes applied to both pirates and the individuals targeted by their crimes, and to break them would come with severe consequences. Today we're going to be looking at some of the methods used to punish both fellow crewmates and captured enemies on board pirate ships, ranging from the relatively tame to the violent and terrifyingly extreme. Many pirates who broke these laws were convicted of a multitude of transgressions, including but not limited to crimes such as cowardice, treachery, disobedience, or even untidiness. Obviously, when the golden age of piracy came to an end, many pirates were captured and killed by the governments of Europe and the Caribbean, and a few of the segments explored in this video will cover these punishments too. Many of them were no less brutal than the torments inflicted on one another aboard the pirate ships. A word of warning before we begin, many of these punishments were outright methods of torture, which often resulted in pirates or captives going through immense pain or even death. If you are squeamish or sensitive to such topics, it may be a good idea to proceed with caution. Without further ado, let's take a trip through time to explore the brutal world of pirate punishments. Welcome to Walk the Plank. Environmental punishments, making the most of the unforgiving seas. Many pirates were exceedingly creative with how they chose to punish those that had run afoul of them. Often pirates were entirely surrounded by water on all sides. Deep, rough, dangerous waters ravaged by tropical storms and crashing waves. Occasionally, pirates would happen across deserted islands or sparsely populated archipelagos. For some, this would have made for a tropical paradise. For others, it spelled doom. Many aspects of the picturesque Caribbean's environment could be used against you if your captors knew how. When you think pirate punishments, the first one that likely comes to mind may be walking the plank. It's a staple of pirate literature and lore. A furious captain with his crew in tow jeer and shout at the hapless recipient of the punishment as they edge them towards the end of a plank jutting out across the edge of the ship. Cutlasses drawn, they edge towards the condemned man as they order him to walk the plank, forcing him to either jump from the plank's edge into the sea or face a painful death by the hands of the crew. It's a term that has become synonymous with pirate captains of the golden age of piracy, but one with little weight behind it. The first mention of walking the plank comes not from the annals of history, but from Daniel Defoe's A General History of the Pirates, first published in 1724, where he described ancient Mediterranean practices of punishing Roman captives in a similar manner. Other authors in the 1800s adapted this further into a work of fiction, featuring the punishment in books such as Treasure Island. It would seem that the plank as we know it was never walked, it is merely a work of fiction. That being said, it is fair to assume that pirates did use the sea as a manner of execution or abandonment. It's thought that some pirate crews dealt with unruly or disobedient crewmates by simply tossing them overboard. There's little evidence to support this, however. What we do know is that pirates use their environment in other sinister ways to punish people. The most common of these environmental punishments was marooning. Reserved for treacherous or cowardly pirates, this involved the captain literally abandoning the victim on one of the many deserted islands occupying the Caribbean. In some instances, pirates were abandoned in small groups on islands containing nothing more than a few trees and rocks. In order to survive, the marooned would need to quickly find a way off such islands if food and water were unavailable. The lucky few were able to find a way back to the mainland through island hopping or a surprise rescue, but many others were not so lucky. Death came quickly from exposure or dehydration. Many pirates were sent away on these islands with a grim offering: a pistol, a bottle of rum, and some gunpowder. This was essentially a show of mercy from the captain who marooned them. If they chose, the marooned were given the chance to take their lives early and avoid the horrors of exposure. Another instance of creative use of the Caribbean's environment to punish a pirate captive was the legendary practice of keel hauling. Another famous method of pirate torture, yet another that may or may not have actually existed in this time. Keel hauling was said to be practiced by pirates across the Golden Age, typically as a punishment for more serious crimes such as treachery. In this particularly brutal practice, the accused is thought to have been tied at the arms with a rope connected to the mast of the ship, with heavy iron weights attached to the legs. From here, the pirate crew would toss the victim overboard, dragging them across the underside of the boat. chipped wood, iron fixings, and abrasive barnacles would then rip into the flesh of the accused, tearing up their back and arms, all the while they were held under salt water, unable to breathe, with the salt providing further pain. Many pirates died from drowning before they reached the other side of the ship. While the practice is referred to across the 17th and 18th centuries, it's unclear whether or not pirates actually employed the method in their judicial systems. Punishments on board the ship. For minor misdemeanors or for a quick and easy punishment method, sentences could be carried out on board the pirate ships. A very simple and accessible method of punishing a fellow pirate was to clap them in irons. Effectively, the offending pirate would be placed in heavy shackles around their wrists and ankles, causing extreme discomfort and limiting their movement. This would be a massive inconvenience when aboard a ship faced with the constant possibility of attack, and many pirate captains opted to confine the offender to the darkest, lowest recesses of the ship, almost like a maritime jail on board the vessel. In these areas, pirates would be given very little access to food and water as punishment for their crimes, which usually involved stealing from other members of the crew. If a pirate wasn't stowed away below deck, they could just as easily be left out on the deck in a storm or hung, suspended in a basket from the ship's bowsprit and to the very front of the ship. Some pirate captains took their punishment to the extreme, even for a crime as seemingly minor as stealing from another crewmate. Pirate Captain Bartholomew Roberts, infamously known as Black Bart, would employ a rather brutal technique for those who had pickpocketed another pirate: mutilation. Specifically, mutilation of facial features. Stories go that he would order the mutilation of the accused's nose and ears, slitting or severing them before marooning them on islands populated with small groups of people. Other pirates are thought to have been even more brutal, specifically to captives from ships they had boarded. Edward Lowe, a particularly notorious pirate who operated towards the end of the Golden Age, is thought to have been a cruel captain who was particularly ruthless when handing out his own judicial punishments. Reportedly, Lowe once captured a Portuguese merchant ship and was particularly brutal to the captain. After severing his ears, he would proceed to cut off the lips of the captain. If that wasn't enough, Lowe decided to cook the severed lips, force-feeding them to the man they once belonged to. Given that many pirate ambushes happened far from ports, it was likely that the victims of these atrocities would have to wait a long time before proper medical supplies were available, meaning that a sentence of mutilation was not simply that. It came with the high risk of infection, which under the right circumstances could have been deadly. Some pirates were punished using more traditional torture methods though. You may have heard of the cat o' nine tails, a modified and deadly version of the whip developed for use in the slave trade to maim and wound Africans brought over as slaves to the Americas. The year of the slave trade coincided with several years from the Golden Age of piracy, and as such some captains managed to get their hands on the cat o' nine tails. The weapon consisted of a whip split into 9 individual strands which were tied in tight knots at the end of each strand. The rope was often reinforced with leather and ivory, and occasionally small hooks or iron balls would be threaded into the strands. When used with a whipping motion on a person's back, it had the capability of causing immense damage, leaving the lash marks of the whip while simultaneously creating cuts and bruises where the hooks and balls made contact. The 1724 Pirate Code of Captain John Phillips, a pirate of the Golden Age, stated that the cat o' nine tails could be used to hand out up to 39 lashes across the bare skin of an offender. Any more than that though, it was thought would be enough to kill a man. In truth, there was large variation in how many lashes were handed out. Some pirates were able to withstand huge numbers of lashes, while some men are known to have died after only receiving a few. It would have been an extremely painful punishment, one with almost unmatched barbarism across the Golden Age of piracy. One of the more bizarre punishments administered on board a pirate ship was that of sweating. More of a psychological torment than a physical torture, used more for keeping offenders in line than for causing pain or death. The offender would be tied to the ship's central mast and likely also tied at the hands so that they could not undo the knot. They would then be made to dance at the point of guns and cutlasses around the mast as the crewmates shouted and jeered insults at them. Often they would be jabbed and prodded with daggers as they danced, whilst another pirate played the fiddle to add to the humiliation. Government punishments for pirates. As piracy broke down towards the end of the Golden Age in roughly the 1720s to the 1730s, governments needed to employ their own violent methods to eradicate the remaining pirates across the Caribbean. While many pirates handed themselves in and gave up their lifestyle following the King's pardon, you can see our video on the end of piracy for more details on this, others were forcibly captured and sentenced to a series of varying punishments, all of which ended in the death of those accused. The most popular method of executing a pirate was hanging them from the neck until they died. Many convicted pirates who were captured by the authorities were arrested and taken to London on a long voyage across the sea. They were held in cell-like rooms on board these ships where they awaited their execution when the ship docked in London. Many pirates were hanged at a place known as Execution Dock in East London, specifically in an area called Wapping. These docks were typically reserved for the executions of maritime criminals, pirates, smugglers, mutineers, naval deserters, and the like. Execution Dock was in operation from around 1400, and the hangings that took place there were not your conventional gallows-style hangings synonymous with the history of London. Rather than be suspended from a rope on dry land, pirates were often executed by hanging them suspended partially underwater, perhaps to reflect the nature of their crimes. Crowds of London citizens would gather on the docks to watch the deaths of these pirates who were handcuffed with a rope looped around their necks. From here, the pirates were pushed into the water with the rope around their necks suspended from the docks or a wooden stake on the side of the docks where they would suffocate. Sometimes, if the pirate was executed at a time of high tide, they would drown as the water enveloped their bodies. More primitive versions of this method would see the convicted simply tied to a stake in the water. When the tide comes in, their bodies would be covered by the waves. Usually, when the pirates were killed in this way, their bodies would be kept there for a few days in order to serve as a reminder. Take part in piracy, and this same fate will await you. William the Kid was one such pirate who was executed in this manner in 1701. His body was covered in thick layers of pitch to keep it fresh whilst it hung in place for a while. When he was removed from the docks, he was suspended in an iron gibbet outside Tilbury in Essex for a total of 3 years. A particularly brutal way to go. Sometimes governments would even adopt their own form of marooning. Some isolated islands in the Caribbean, such as the aptly nicknamed Dead Man's Cay in what is now modern-day Jamaica, were used as execution spots. Here, however, the pirate was not hanged, nor was he shot or mutilated. Simply, he was left there. The government wanted to ensure this as a method of execution, however, not just punishment. While a pirate crew would show what might be considered to some as mercy when they abandoned their crewmates on deserted islands, the government were willing to show no such thing. Instead, particularly on Dead Man's Cay, they were locked in a hanging iron cage suspended from a post in the sand. Here they were exposed to the full force of the blazing tropical Jamaican sun and heat. No food or water was provided to them, and no gun was offered as an act of mercy. Simply, the pirates executed in this way would boil alive in these cages, forced into a slow, painful death of dehydration and exposure. Usually, a pirate would die in no more than a few days when executed in this manner. At least being sent to the execution dock was relatively quick. Outro. So there's our insight into the brutal punishments and consequences that awaited an offending pirate or would-be pirate in the case of government punishments. Often these punishments were unthinkably brutal, showing no mercy to criminals convicted of even the smallest transgressions. But in a world dominated by crime, this was often the only option to reinforce rule. A pirate ship, as lucrative as the work it held was not a particularly pleasant place to be at any level of the ship. If a captain failed to enforce their laws, they would have their crews running amok. If they enforced the rules too harshly, they faced mutiny. It may have been a necessity in such an environment, but there is no doubt that pirates caused much suffering, even on board their ships. Thank you for watching this episode of Walk the Plank, and I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers!